The wind had a taste of metal that morning, cold, thin, and mean. It scraped across the plains like a dull blade, stirring dust and brittle grass that had long since given up on growing. The town of Sanduras crouched beneath a gray sky, a cluster of warped wood and tired souls too stubborn to move on. No birds sang there, only the groan of wagon wheels and the dry squeak of a sign that swung from one rusted chain, O'Reilly's Trading Post. Eli Cartwright rode in slow, his horse limping from the long ride south. The saddle leather creaked with every step, and the man on it looked carved from the same weather that bit his face. His hat brim was pulled low, his eyes half-shadowed, his coat torn at the shoulder. He wasn't the kind that drew notice, but he drew it all the same, because he didn't belong. Sanduras had seen men like him before, the kind that spoke little and carried ghosts that didn't leave at sundown. He tied his horse outside the post and stepped in from the cold. Inside it smelled of kerosene, stale tobacco, and the sour tang of spilled whiskey. Barrels were stacked by the walls, their lids pried open to reveal tools, flour, bullets, and salt pork. A few men leaned on the counter, hats pushed back, watching something in the far corner. That's when Eli saw them. Two girls, or rather young women, sat on the floor near the stove, wrists bound with rope. Their dark hair was tangled, their shawls torn and caked with dust. One was no older than 18, the other maybe 15, though her eyes were ancient. A dealer, fat and red-faced, stood nearby, puffing on a cigar. His grin had too many teeth. "Fine pair," he said to the room. "Strong stock. Good workers if you can tame 'em. Tell you what." He slapped his thigh with a greasy hand. "Buy one. Get one free." The room erupted in laughter. Eli didn't move. He just stood there, his jaw tightening. Something behind his ribs stirred. Not outrage exactly, but that old aching guilt that sometimes came without warning. He had once promised a dying woman he'd live gentle. That promise had rotted inside him like a buried seed. The dealer's gaze landed on him. "You lookin', mister? Ain't often a man gets two for the price of one." Eli's voice came low, rasped by dust and whiskey. "What did they do?" The dealer smirked. "Wrong skin. Wrong tribe. Army broke up their camp last month. These two were all that was left. You want 'em or not?" The crowd's eyes turned to Eli now, waiting to see what kind of man he was. He looked at the sisters again, the older one staring back, defiant even in silence, the younger trembling but trying not to. He could have walked away. Lord knew he should have. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out the worn leather pouch that held what little coin he had left, and dropped it on the counter. The sound was heavy in the room. "Take it," he said. The dealer blinked. "That's near all of it, mister." "Then that's what they're worth." Laughter turned awkward. The dealer hesitated, then shrugged. "Your mistake, cowboy. Take your new family and be gone." Eli cut the ropes from the sisters' wrists with his pocket knife. They didn't thank him, didn't speak at all, only followed when he motioned toward the door. Outside, the wind hit them full in the face. The horse shifted under the weight of three. It was a long ride back to his land, and not a single word passed between them. By the time they reached the Cartwright homestead, dusk had fallen. The cabin stood low against the basin's edge, built from cottonwood logs, its chimney leaning like a tired old man. Eli dismounted first, helped the younger girl down. She flinched at his touch, then led the horse into the shed. The older sister guided her sibling toward the porch, her arm firm and protective. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust lay thick on the shelves, the tools by the wall untouched since summer. The hearth was dark, the kettle dry. Eli lit the fire with flint and steel, coaxing the flame until it caught on the dry pine. The sisters stood by the door, their shawls drawn tight, watching him as if he were another storm to survive. "There's stew in the pot," he muttered, pointing toward the iron kettle he'd left hanging. "Ain't much. You can have what's left." The older one gave no answer, but after a long pause, she led the younger closer to the fire. They crouched near it, palms open to the heat. Eli stepped outside for a moment, letting the cold bite his skin. He needed the air. Out in the dark, the land stretched endless and empty. He looked toward the hill where a small wooden cross stood beneath a cottonwood tree. The wind moved through its branches, making a sound like whispering. Mary, his wife, lay beneath that tree, 3 winters gone, and he still hadn't forgiven himself for how she'd died. When he came back inside, the room smelled faintly of smoke and something softer, cedar maybe, or sage. The sisters had unwrapped a small bundle from their shawls, a strip of beadwork, bright against the cabin's gloom. They placed it on the mantel beside Mary's photograph, as if to claim their small place in that house of ghosts. Eli stood by the door, unsure whether to speak. Words felt too loud here. Instead, he hung his coat by the peg and poured himself a cup of cold coffee from the pot on the stove. He sat at the table, the cup trembling in his hands, and listened to the sounds, the fire popping, the faint crackle of fabric as the sisters moved closer to warmth, the slow, steady breathing of the younger one falling asleep. Outside, the wind shifted to a softer tone, brushing against the window like an old friend who'd come to listen. Eli took a long sip of the bitter coffee and looked toward the fire. The older sister's eyes caught his, dark, steady, unreadable. Neither spoke. There was no need, for the first time in a long while. The cabin was not silent out of emptiness, but because there were too many hearts beating inside it. Emotional tone and realization. Isolation meets reluctant mercy. Eli's act is not born of heroism but quiet guilt, a payment for sins he never confessed. The cabin, once his refuge, now breathes with uneasy life. Strangers bound not by trust, but by the simple need to survive. Winter took the land slow, like a sickness that wouldn't name itself. By December, the basin lay under frost so thick it cracked when the sun hit it. The wind moved low through the valley, scraping across the frozen grass with the sound of paper tearing. Days bled into each other, gray, unmarked, and long. Eli Cartwright rose before dawn each morning, as he always had. He split wood until his arms burned, the sound of his axe the only heartbeat the valley knew. When he stopped, the silence pressed close, heavy enough to hear his own breath cloud in the air. The sisters stayed inside most days. Through the cabin window, Eli could sometimes see them moving, slow, graceful, always together. Nalin the elder tended the fire and kept the space ordered. Tala, the younger, coughed often, but smiled at small things. The way smoke curled from the stovepipe, the shimmer of frost on the window glass. They spoke in a tongue Eli couldn't understand, soft syllables that rose and fell like song. He never asked their meanings. Words he had learned didn't save much. By night, the 3 of them shared the same light, but not the same warmth. Eli ate at the table, the sisters by the fire. He didn't look at them directly, though he noticed details he wished he didn't, the way Nalin's hands were scarred along the knuckles, how Tala's eyes closed too often from fever. Sometimes he caught Nalin watching him, her gaze unreadable, measuring maybe, or pitying, he couldn't tell which. One evening, as the wind howled around the eaves, Eli found the kettle cleaned and refilled, the stew thickened with something new, dried corn maybe, or herbs he didn't own. He looked toward the fire. The sisters didn't meet his eyes. He sat, ate slowly, and felt that strange, hollow gratitude twist inside him like pain. When he stepped outside afterward, the sky was the color of pewter. The cottonwood by Mary's grave creaked in the wind, its branches bare, its trunk rimed with frost. He stood there a long time, hat in hand, breath clouding. "Couldn't fix much, could I?" he muttered to the dark. "Not then, not now." No answer came, only the faint cry of a coyote far off in the hills. He remembered the last night of Mary's life as if it were happening behind the cabin wall, the lantern light flickering, the midwife whispering prayers that didn't help. His wife's face pale as linen, lips cracked from thirst. He had held her hand until it went cold, then held the child that never cried. He'd buried them both before dawn, the sky streaked in red like it mourned with him. After that, he'd stopped praying. Stopped feeling much of anything, except the dull need to keep his hands busy. Fences, tools, horses, anything that didn't talk back. Inside, he heard Tala coughing again, the kind of cough that came from deep, stubborn places. He went back in and stoked the fire higher, the light spilling gold over the rough log walls. The sisters sat close together. Nalin's arm around the younger. Tala's face was damp with sweat, but she smiled weakly when Eli set a cup of water beside her. "Drink," he said simply. Nalin's eyes lifted, wary but not defiant. After a pause, she nodded once. A soldier's nod, not a woman's. It was the first acknowledgement between them since that day in Sanduris. Later that night, Eli couldn't sleep. He sat at the table with his rifle half cleaned, watching the fire die down to coals. He thought of the sound of Mary's voice reading scripture by lamplight, of her small hands shelling beans in that same chair where Nalin now sat. The memory ached, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like punishment. He rose, went to the door, and stopped. On the step sat a small clay bowl, still warm, covered with a cloth. Inside was a portion of the stew he'd made the night before, now richer, flavored with something wild and green. He stared at it for a long time, then closed the door quietly and stood there in the dark. His throat burned. Mary used to do the same, leave him food when he stayed out too long, too stubborn to eat. He set the bowl on the table but didn't touch it. The firelight caught the rim, glinting like an offering. Something inside him cracked, small, invisible but real. The days that followed moved slower still. The rhythm of their survival settled into pattern. Eli mended fences that didn't need mending, just to keep his hands from remembering. Nalin boiled herbs in the mornings, filling the room with sharp, clean smells that made Tala breathe easier. Once, Eli came home early to find the two of them outside, hanging strips of cloth to dry. The wind lifted Nalin's braid across her shoulder, and sunlight caught on the beads woven near its end, blue and white, like sky and bone. She didn't turn when he passed, but he felt something shift in the air. A faint understanding, too fragile for words. That night, when he poured his coffee, he made 3 cups instead of 1. He set 2 near the fire before taking his own to the porch. From inside, he heard Tala's laughter, soft and brief, but real. It startled him more than gunfire. Snow began falling that night, a thin silver drift that softened the world. The cabin seemed smaller but warmer, the silence no longer hollow. He dreamed of Mary again, not as she died, but as she lived. Barefoot on the porch, hair loose in the wind, humming as she fed the hens. In the dream, she turned toward him and smiled, as if to say she knew. When Eli woke, dawn was pressing through the window, pale and forgiving. He rose, stretched, and for the first time in months, the ache in his chest felt like something he could carry, not a wound, but a scar healing slow. He looked toward the fire. The sisters were still asleep. Tala curled against Nalin's side, Nalin's hand resting over her sister's hair in a gesture of old protection. Eli watched them for a long time before stepping quietly outside. The sky was clear now, the snow bright against the earth. Smoke rose from the chimney, proof that life, however fragile, still clung here. Eli tipped his hat toward the cottonwood tree and whispered, "Morning, Mary." Then he walked down to the corral, his boots crunching through the frost, the first faint warmth of sun following behind him. Emotional tone and realization, haunting stillness fills the homestead. The 3 lives inside that cabin begin to share a fragile rhythm, not through speech, but through small mercies. Eli's ghosts start to loosen their hold as compassion, wordless and humble, begins to take root beneath the snow. The wind came before the snow, a low, distant moan that rolled across the basin like a warning. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of lead, and the horizon disappeared behind a wall of white. The storm moved fast, swallowing the land 1 mile at a time. Eli Cartwright felt it in his bones long before it hit. He nailed an extra plank over the barn door, checked the horses twice, and stacked the last of the firewood by the porch. The air smelled like iron and ice. Inside, Nalin stood at the window, her shawl drawn tight. "Snow comes hard," she murmured in halting English. Her voice was rough but steady, the words slow as if testing the shape of them after long silence. Eli nodded. Hard enough to keep the world out. By nightfall, the wind had found every crack in the cabin seams. It howled through the chimney, rattled the shutters, and made the roof groan like a tired beast. The fire hissed under the draft, throwing light that danced over the log walls and the three faces within. Tala lay wrapped in quilts near the hearth, her skin pale and damp with fever. Each breath came with a soft wheezing sound. Nalin kept one hand on her sister's forehead, the other gripping the edge of the blanket. She didn't look up when Eli said, "We'll ride out for medicine when it clears." "She will not last long," Nalin said quietly. "Not without the roots she knows." Eli didn't ask what kind of roots she meant. He only nodded again and tightened the rope around the shutter hinges. Outside, the storm gathered its full fury, a blind, roaring sea of white. Hours passed. The roof creaked under the weight of snow. Eli took down a hammer and some nails from the wall and began bracing the beams. The wind beat against the cabin like a living thing. "Hold this," he told Nalin, gesturing to a loose plank. She stood, moving beside him without hesitation. Her hands were steady despite the cold, her movements efficient, practiced. Together they pressed the board into place and nailed it down while snow sifted through the cracks like flour. When they finished, Eli looked at her hands, roughened, scarred, yet graceful in their purpose. "You've done this before," he said. "My father built lodges," she answered simply. "Before the soldiers came." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Some things didn't need more words. Near midnight, the storm hit its worst. The fire burned low. The stew pot was empty. The world outside had vanished into white noise. No direction, no mercy. Inside, the air grew thin and cold enough that each breath steamed. Tala stirred, coughing until blood spotted her lips. Nalin pressed a rag against her mouth, whispering something in Apache that sounded like prayer. When she looked at Eli, her eyes were sharp with fear she couldn't hide. "There is a trapper's hut," he said after a moment, as if the idea had been waiting behind his ribs all along. 5 miles north near the dry creek bed. "He keeps medicine, I think." "Not tonight," she said quickly. "You go out, you die." He pulled on his coat anyway. "I've died before, just didn't stay dead." Nalin stood in his path. "Please. If you die, she dies too." The plea struck deeper than the wind ever could. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Eli rested a hand on her shoulder, a brief, uncertain gesture, and stepped past her into the storm. The cold hit like a hammer. Snow sliced sideways, blinding him within seconds. He lowered his head, counting his steps by feel and instinct. The horse balked once, then pushed forward into the white void. There was no sky, no ground, only motion and the endless scream of wind. Time unraveled. The cold crawled through his gloves, through his coat, into his blood. When at last he found the trapper's hut, half buried in snow, he had forgotten his own name. Inside, he found a lantern, a tin of quinine, and a small bottle labeled laudanum. He lit the lamp and caught sight of his hands, gray and rigid, fingers swollen with frost. The skin cracked when he tried to move them. He barely made it back. The horse stumbled into the yard before dawn, its mane white with ice. Eli slid from the saddle and collapsed in the drift by the porch. The last thing he saw was the door flying open, Nalin's figure framed in the firelight, her voice breaking through the storm. "Eli!" When he woke, the world was quiet again. The wind was gone, the fire steady. He lay on the floor wrapped in a blanket, his hands bandaged. The smell of sage and smoke filled the room. Nalin sat beside him, her braid loose over one shoulder, eyes dark and hollow from sleeplessness. "You're lucky," she said softly. "The snow stopped when you did." He tried to speak, but his lips cracked from the effort. She lifted a cup to his mouth. The broth inside was bitter, earthy, unfamiliar, her people's medicine. He drank without question. "How's the girl?" he asked after a long silence. "Sleeping," Nalin said. "Better now. You brought the right thing." He closed his eyes, relief and exhaustion mixing into one heavy ache. When he opened them again, she was wrapping his palms in a piece of cloth. Her own shawl, the same one she'd worn since the day they met. The weave was fine, dyed with red and black patterns, its threads glinting faintly in the firelight. "You don't need," he began. She shook her head. "It's strong. Better than cloth you have." Her voice trembled slightly, though her hands did not. The shawl's scent, smoke, cedar, and faint wildflowers, lingered as she tied the final knot. Outside, the wind had gone still. The world lay hushed under a blanket of white, untouched and clean. For a long while they said nothing. The fire popped, the rafters dripped with melting frost, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called, the first sound of life after days of death. Eli looked toward the window, then at her. "Thank you," he said quietly. Nalin's eyes lifted to his, steady and unreadable. "You saved her," she replied. "Now we save you." The dawn light crept across the floorboards, gold and pale, touching the edge of her shawl where it wrapped his hands. He stared at it, the small miracle of color in a world of white, and felt something shift inside him, something warmer than pain. The storm had passed, but it had taken with it the last of the distance between them. Emotional tone and realization. The blizzard becomes both trial and teacher. In risking his life for her sister, Eli breaks through the wall of guilt and indifference that long defined him. Nalin's quiet act of care seals the bond, not of romance yet, but of shared humanity. When dawn comes, both are changed. She sees that mercy can exist without debt, and he learns that survival can be holy when it is shared. The thaw came slow that year. Winter clung to the valleys even as spring crept down from the hills, a patient conqueror reclaiming what the cold had taken. The drifts around the cabin melted into rivulets that carved thin scars through the mud. The horses' hooves sank deep. The world smelled of wet earth, smoke, and old sorrow. Inside, the air had changed. It was not silence of fear anymore, but the uncertain quiet that comes when words might break something fragile. The storm had bound the three together in survival. Yet what remained afterward was harder to name. Eli worked the same as always, mending fences, checking traps, cleaning the rifle that never seemed to leave his reach. But he moved slower now, careful with his frostbitten hands. Sometimes he would stop and watch Nalin across the yard, where she carried buckets of water from the well or brushed down the mare. Her movements were deliberate, graceful in a way that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with patience. She never asked for permission to help. She simply began doing what needed doing, as if she had always belonged there. Tala's strength returned in small steps. By day she fed the chickens or helped grind corn. By night she sat close to the fire, humming faint songs of her people. Eli often listened from the porch, not understanding the words but knowing somehow they were about loss and endurance. Days passed in rhythm. The snow vanished, the ground softened, and the sound of wind through thawed cottonwoods filled the gaps between breaths. One morning, while Eli was cutting new fence posts, he noticed Nalin standing a few yards away, her shawl caught in the breeze. She was watching the horizon, eyes narrowed toward the empty plain. "Something wrong?" he asked, setting the axe aside. "Riders," she said. He followed her gaze. Dust rose in the distance, 3, maybe 4 men on horseback riding slow. Ranchers from the south side, judging by their coats and the way they rode loose in the saddle. Eli felt the tension crawl up his spine before they even reached the gate. The men pulled up at the fence line, grinning in that way men do when they come looking for trouble. "Well, I'll be damned," one of them said, spitting to the side. "Didn't think I'd see Cartwright keeping company with savages." Eli said nothing. His jaw worked, but no words came. Another laughed. "You trading horses now or just collecting pets?" The youngest of the group leaned forward in his saddle. "Heard there were Apache girls taken down in Santa Fe last fall. Guess we know who bought the pair." Nalin stood still behind him, her face unreadable. "Best ride on," Eli said, voice low. "Or what?" the man sneered. "You gonna scalp us too?" The bottle came first, spinning through the air, catching the sunlight before it shattered against the fence post beside Nalin. The sound cracked something inside Eli. He moved before he thought, before memory or reason could hold him back. In 2 strides he was over the fence, his fist catching the man square in the mouth. Blood sprayed and the others shouted. Horses reared. The world blurred into mud, shouts, and rage. Eli didn't stop when the man fell. He kept swinging, knuckles slamming into flesh until hands grabbed him from behind and dragged him off. Christ, Cartwright, that's enough! One of the others yelled, hauling his friend into the saddle. You've lost your damn mind. The men rode off fast, one clutching his jaw, the others cursing over their shoulders. Mud and blood stained Eli's coat. He stood alone in the churned yard, breathing hard, fists trembling. When he finally looked up, Nalin was watching him. Her eyes were dark, not afraid, but disappointed in a way that cut deeper than any insult. That night, rain came soft and steady. It drummed against the roof in a rhythm older than language. Eli sat by the hearth, still tasting the salt of anger at the back of his throat. Nalin stood near the doorway, her shawl draped over one shoulder. Violence brings more violence, she said at last. Her voice was calm, but the words carried weight. You fight one, more will come. Eli stared into the fire. You'd have done nothing. I would have walked away, she said simply. My people learned long ago. Blood answers blood, and it never ends. He turned toward her, eyes weary. And if they'd hurt you? She met his gaze. Then you would still lose. Because you'd stop being who you are. He had no answer for that. The rain deepened, and the firelight flickered across the walls, the same walls that had held Mary's laughter once. Before all of it had gone quiet, after a long silence, Nalin crossed the room and sat near the old rocking chair by the window, the one Eli had carved for Mary years ago. Its arms were etched with small shapes, hearts, vines, initials worn smooth by time. She ran her fingers over the carvings, tracing the grooves as if reading a story. This was hers? She asked. Eli nodded. Mary, my wife, she must have been kind. He hesitated. She was good, softer than I deserved. Nalin rocked the chair once, slow and thoughtful. She loved this place, he swallowed. She made it home. They sat in silence again, the only sound the soft creak of wood beneath her. When she finally spoke, her tone had gentled. Maybe this land can still be home, she said, but not if it's guarded by anger. Eli rubbed his hands together, feeling the roughness of old scars beneath the bandages. Hard to forget what men like that take from you. Then teach them something different, Nalin replied. Show strength without hate. That is the harder way. Her words lingered long after she rose and returned to the fire, where Tala slept beneath a blanket. Outside, the rain eased to a whisper. Eli watched her settle the logs, her shadow moving softly over the walls. In that moment, something inside him shifted again, the same warmth that had come after the storm, only deeper now, tangled with shame and respect. It wasn't desire that bound him to her presence. It was reverence. He thought of Mary, of the chair she had rocked in when she carried their child. He thought of Nalin tracing those same carvings with hands that had known chains, but still built gentleness from ruin. By the time dawn broke, the rain had stopped. The yard steamed in the first light. Mud glistened where the bottle had shattered. Eli stepped outside, breathing the cold. Clean air, behind him, through the open door. Nalin's voice came, low, steady, and certain. Violence brings more violence, she repeated. He nodded without turning. The words carving themselves into him like scripture. Emotional tone and realization. The thaw brings more than spring. It exposes the buried anger in both Eli and the land itself. Through confrontation and quiet counsel, Nalin teaches him that strength without mercy only breeds ghosts. Eli begins to unlearn the violence he once mistook for justice, while she reclaims a measure of power through calm defiance and moral clarity. The wind changed that night. It came low across the basin, dry as bone and sharp with dust. By sundown, the horizon burned in the color of old embers, copper, rose, and blood. Eli Cartwright felt the unease before the danger showed itself, the way a man does when the land goes too still. He had been mending the corral gate while Nalin gathered water from the well. Tala slept inside, her breath shallow but steady. For days she had been weaker, coughing blood into rags when she thought no one saw. Nalin carried the worry silently, the same way she carried everything else. When darkness fell, the wind rose. It whistled through the dry grass and set the lantern flame shivering on the porch. Eli went to douse it, that small, thoughtless habit that saved lives in dry country. But the smell reached him before he could move. Smoke. He turned, and the world behind the barn glowed orange. In the next instant, the flames roared up from the haystacks, too high, too sudden to be accident. The barn was burning. Fire! He shouted, running for the trough. Nalin, get water! She was already there, skirts gathered, eyes wide with calm terror. Buckets flew between them in frantic rhythm. The horses screamed from inside, pounding against the stall doors. Eli dropped his bucket and ran in through the smoke. Heat swallowed him whole. The air tasted of ash and panic. He kicked open the first stall, slapping the horse's flank until it bolted through the doorway into the night. Another and another. Until a falling beam split the rafters with a sound like thunder. Outside, Nalin cried his name. He turned toward the voice. But a beam crashed down across his shoulder, pinning him against the ground. Pain flared white-hot. The fire licked closer, greedy and alive. Eli! She came through the doorway, a shadow against the inferno, and without hesitation plunged into the smoke. He saw her only in fragments, the glint of her shawl, the dark sweep of her braid, the fierce set of her jaw. She grabbed the beam, heaving with all her strength, coughing against the heat. "Go back!" he shouted, but she only pressed on, teeth bared in effort. The wood shifted an inch, then another, until he could roll free. He pulled her close and stumbled toward the light, both half-blind from the smoke. Outside, the cold air cut through the heat, but she did not stop. She turned again to the barn, shouting for the horses. One last mare remained inside, kicking wildly. Eli tried to stop her, but Nalin ran back through the doorway. In that instant, her braid caught a spark. It flared like a torch. Eli lunged, wrapping his arms around her and forcing her to the ground, smothering the flame with his bare hands. The smell of burnt hair and skin filled the air. She cried out, and he pressed her down, whispering through the smoke, "Easy now, easy," until the fire on her head was dead. The barn collapsed moments later, a red roar swallowed by the night. The last horse burst through the wreckage and fled into the open field. They lay together in the dirt, chests heaving, faces blackened with soot. His hands burned, blistering anew over the old frost scars. Her braid was half gone, singed to the crown, but her eyes still burned bright, fierce, alive, defiant. When dawn came, the fire was nothing but smoke and ruin. The barn stood in black ribs against the sky. The smell of char and wet ash hung heavy. Eli and Nalin sat side by side on the ground, the world around them gray and quiet. Neither spoke. Their hands, resting between them, found each other without thought, burned, shaking, bound by something neither could name. Tala emerged from the cabin wrapped in a blanket. Her face was pale, lips trembling as she looked at the wreckage. She tried to call out, but her voice failed her. Nalin rose and went to her, gathering her sister into her arms. The younger girl coughed again, a harsh, rattling sound that bent her thin frame, and the blood on her hand glistened dark as the cinders underfoot. Eli stood watching, helpless as ever before the quiet suffering of others. His land was scarred now, like the people who walked it, but in the midst of ruin, there was something pure. The way dawn light touched the ash, turning it silver. He went to where Nalin knelt, holding Tala close, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "They'll come back," he said softly. "Whoever did this, I know," she whispered. "But they can only burn what they understand," he frowned. "And what's that?" "The things we build with fear," she said. "They never learned how to build anything else." The wind stirred her singed hair. Eli wanted to speak, to apologize, to promise, to say something that would ease the weight between them. But words felt small beside what they had just endured. Instead, he walked to the well, drew up a bucket, and began dousing the smoldering embers in silence. The steam rose in soft clouds. Nalin joined him, passing the bucket back and forth, their movements slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, like washing away a sin. When the work was done, They stood together at the edge of the ruins. The barn was gone. The horses that had survived grazed nervously in the far field. The sky had turned clear and blue, impossibly calm after the night's chaos. Tala sat on the porch, her blanket pulled tight. The smoke drifted around her like a veil. She looked smaller than ever, but her eyes followed them, not afraid, just tired. Nalin's voice broke the silence. "The fire took what we owed," she said quietly. "The debts, the shame, all burned now." Eli looked at her hands, black with soot and blood, and then at his own. "Seems it took a fair bit more." "Sometimes that's the price," she replied. "To start again." They sat down in the ashes, the two of them side by side, facing the horizon. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of rain and smoke. Between them, their fingers intertwined, not out of passion or comfort, but out of recognition. The land around them was scarred but clean. The fire had devoured the past, and what remained was raw and real, the truth of survival. For the first time, the silence between them was not heavy. It was peace. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. "Guess the land still got life left in it." "So do we," Nalin answered. The sun lifted higher, gilding the ash, the ruins, and the faces of those who had endured. Emotional tone and realization. The night's fire strips everything to its essence: flesh, land, pride. Through mutual sacrifice, Eli and Nalin's bond transforms into something sacred and wordless. The destruction cleanses the shame of the past and replaces it with an earned sense of peace. Spring came early that year, soft and gold, with grass pushing through the blackened earth, as if even ashes could give birth again. The valley seemed gentler now, washed clean by rain. The smell of smoke had faded into something green, something alive. Weeks passed. The rhythm of work returned, slow and deliberate. Eli rebuilt the corral fence with what timber the fire had spared. Nalin tended the small garden behind the cabin, planting seeds with fingers still scarred from that night. Tala, pale and frail, rested near the window where sunlight fell across her face. She smiled more often now. Even as her body weakened, a lightness clung to her, a peace that neither Eli nor Nalin could name. Sometimes, at dusk, she would hum to herself, the same faint melody she had sung during the winter storms. It drifted through the cabin like smoke, haunting, tender, familiar. The Lawmen came on the 4th week after the fire. 2 of them, riding up from the county line in dust-colored coats, faces drawn from habit and suspicion. They asked questions in their steady, official tones. Who had started it? Where Eli had been? What he'd seen? Eli answered plain. "We fought the flames till dawn. Never saw the men who set it." The sheriff nodded slowly, looking past him toward the field. "Funny thing," he said. "Found 3 bodies near the canyon 2 days back. Looks like they tried to rustle stock from McKinney's place and ran into their own fire trap." Eli's jaw tightened. "That so?" "That's so," the man said, studying him a long moment. Then with a faint nod he added, "World's got a way of settling its own debts, I guess." When the riders left, the air felt lighter, though no one said it aloud. That night, rain fell again, not the cold rain of winter, but the kind that carries the scent of life. Eli stood on the porch, letting it soak his hat and shoulders, and watched Nalin through the window. She sat beside Tala's bed, holding her sister's hand, lips moving in silent prayer. He knew that language by now, not its words, but its cadence. It was a song of crossing, of farewell. By morning, Tala was gone. She passed quietly, with the faintest smile on her lips, as if she had seen something waiting just beyond the dawn. Nalin did not weep. She sat still for a long time, her fingers tangled in her sister's hair, before she rose and went to the trunk near the wall. From it she took a small bundle of weaving, threads dyed with roots and ash, the last of what she had carried from her people's camp. Outside, under the cottonwood tree, the earth was soft. Eli had buried Mary there years ago beneath a marker made of plain stone. The grass had grown wild around it since, untouched. Now Nalin knelt beside that resting place and began to braid. She wove slowly, with purpose, her fingers moving through the dark strands of Tala's hair, weaving grief into pattern, memory into meaning. When she was done, she laid the braid between the two graves, Mary's and Tala's, settler and native wife and sister, both claimed by the same land. Eli stood a few steps away, hat in hand, saying nothing. The wind stirred through the branches, scattering the first cotton seeds of the season like pale snow. When she rose, Nalin turned to him. "They will sleep here," she said softly. "Together, your wife and my sister, both women of the same earth," he nodded. "Seems right." For days after, the cabin felt emptier than before. The silence was not sharp or cold, it was full, reverent. The kind of quiet that follows truth once it's been spoken aloud. Nalin stayed on to help finish the spring planting, but Eli could see the distance growing in her eyes. She watched the horizon the way some people watch a river, knowing it will call them home again. One morning, near the end of May, he found her saddling the bay mare. Her few belongings were tied neatly behind the saddle, a blanket, a water skin, her weaving bundle wrapped in linen. "You heading east?" he asked. She looked toward the hills. "To the people who remain. To the places we are still allowed to walk," he swallowed. "There's room here if you want it." "I know," she said. "But some things are not meant to stay." He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. When the horse was ready, he helped tighten the cinch, his fingers brushing the worn leather. The morning sun spilled across the land, turning everything gold. The fences, the grass, even the scars on their hands. Nalin stepped into the saddle, pausing before she took up the reins. "Eli," she said quietly, "when you gave your coin that day, you bought what could not be owned." He met her gaze. "Didn't mean to buy anything," she smiled faintly. "You paid for freedom. Now it's yours too." He wanted to tell her that freedom felt heavier than any chain, that it was lonelier too, but she was already turning the horse toward the road. She rode slowly at first, the mare's hooves soft on the new grass. The wind caught the ends of her shortened braid and carried them like a dark ribbon behind her. Eli stood on the porch, watching until she was no more than a shadow against the morning light. When she disappeared beyond the ridge, he went back inside. The cabin was quiet. No voices, no laughter, only the creak of the old rocking chair as it swayed in the draft. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down by the window and stared out at the cottonwood tree. The braid still lay there between the graves, bright against the grass. Two worlds, two griefs, bound together not by blood or bargain, but by mercy. He took a slow sip, the warmth steadying his hands. The wind came down from the hills, stirring the ashes left from the fire months before, lifting them into the sunlight until they sparkled like dust made of gold. Eli closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he did not think of what he'd lost, only of what had survived. Emotional tone and realization. Acceptance replaces struggle. Through death, mercy, and quiet companionship, both Eli and Nalin reclaim their dignity. The story closes not with union but with understanding. That love in its truest form is the courage to set another free.